Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. My name is Michelle James. So today we are continuing on with our Perform Workshop webinar series, and today we are looking at part 2, risk factors and the Perform worksheet. So we plan to run the session today for about 45 minutes. Please make sure, if you haven't already done so, that you have printed out the 3 documents that we're going to be using during the session, and also that you have a couple of pens handy to use for the practical activities that we're going to be doing. Now, the documents, if you haven't got them yet, will be on the registration link that you've used to join us today. On the left-hand side there, just have a look under Event Materials. So the main objective of today's session is for you to come away feeling comfortable with using the Perform worksheet to assess a hazardous manual task. So to do that, we're going to have a look at the physical risk factors for manual tasks so that you can identify hazardous manual tasks and those risk factors in your workplace. Then we're going to go through a couple of scenarios to give you a chance to practice using the Perform worksheet. So we'll work through 2 activities based on the worksheets that you've hopefully got printed. Just about questions. Now, I won't have time to answer questions today. We have quite a bit of content to get through. But if you do have any questions, please do use the Q&A function on the right-hand side there, and I will follow up with your questions after the webinar and get back to you over the next couple of days. All right, well, before we get into all of that, I just thought it might be helpful to quickly recap what we looked at last week. So in summary, we talked about why we need to manage manual tasks, and because they are the main cause of our sprain and strain injuries. When we thought about the financial costs of those sprain and strain injuries, not just the impact on your workers' compensation premium, but all those other costs around the injuries that can impact on businesses, that financial cost can be enormous. So preventing those types of injuries really makes good business sense. We also talked about the legislation, and managing those injuries is part of your legislative requirement. There are a number of ways we looked at that you can manage hazardous manual tasks, and Perform is really just one option out there. But it is a really simplified approach, and because of its simplicity and ease of use, it has been successful in many workplaces. We talked about some of the critical elements that the Perform requires to be implemented successfully. It requires worker participation. So it's based on the participative ergonomics approach, and that kind of approach utilises the expert knowledge that the workers have to complete the risk assessments on their tasks and to develop effective controls that they know will work. We also highlighted the importance of having management commitment and supporting the Perform program. And in particular, this would look like supporting workers to have time offline to undertake some Perform-related activities, like letting workers engage in training and developing controls. And management also being supportive of implementing the approved controls. And someone to drive the program, or a site champion, is another critical factor in implementing the program. So now let's have a look at hazardous manual tasks. So what is a hazardous manual task? What are we talking about here? Well, we'll have a look at the definition in our regulation. So you can see that's up there on the screen. And if we have a look at that top paragraph, that's really any kind of manual task. So the point is, it's anything where a person is lifting, lowering, pushing, pulling, carrying. It's a wide range of manual tasks. It's not just lifting and carrying. It's not just manual handling. But not all manual tasks are a problem. So we have a lot of manual tasks, but you only need to worry about the problem ones. And that's where we need to look at the risk factors. Okay, so the risk factors are there, dot pointed under that paragraph. So we have things like repetitive or sustained force, high or sudden force, repetitive movement, sustained or awkward postures, and exposure to vibration. So these risk factors are outlined in the regulation, and it's the presence of one or more of those that make a manual task a hazardous manual task. Now, when we look at the Perform worksheet, so if you have that handy, refer to the blank one. So it won't have an activity printed on it, it'll just have the Perform template. And if you turn over to worksheet 2, you don't have to do this, but I just want to highlight that you might notice on the Perform worksheet it has a matrix, and it does talk about the risk factors on the worksheet. Now you might notice that the risk factors use slightly different terms. Now the reason for that is, like for example, if you look at the top, exertion, okay, instead of forceful or repetitive or sustained force, it just says exertion. So the reason for that is because Perform was actually developed under the previous legislation, which also had slightly different terminology. So Perform was in line with the legislation before harmonisation. However, the meaning is still the same for us. So for exertion is another way of referring to how much force the person is using, whether it's repetitive, sustained, high or sudden. So we don't need to worry about that. The meaning is essentially the same, and Perform is still a great tool to help you meet compliance with the regulation around hazardous manual tasks. So we've talked about not all manual tasks are a problem. So you only need to assess the hazardous ones. So where you have those risk factors. How do we go about identifying a hazardous manual task? So we've got some suggestions up there. Really, any time you're making a change in the workplace, if you're bringing in new equipment or creating a new process, wherever there's a new change, this might impact on the way the job is done. So you could use the Perform tool at that time. So identifying that as a potential hazardous manual task and doing an assessment, that's a great opportunity. Also, if you've got an indication that something is wrong, and you might want to make a note here, really ask the workers. You might want to put out a survey. You might just want to walk around and talk to them. But speaking with the workers there, asking them if they're aware of any problem manual tasks. You might look at your data around your workers' compensation claims, or people may not be making a claim, but if there's some high absenteeism, that could be an indication that there are some problems. Also, after you've had an incident and you can relate that to a manual task, that's another good time to do your Perform worksheet. Ideally, it's great if you can record all the hazardous manual tasks that you've identified on a hazard register, and that'll help later on when it comes to prioritising which ones that you're going to start off with. It's great to consider your hazardous manual tasks proactively, so try and put in place controls before any incidents happen. So now we're going to have a look at the Perform worksheet. So again, I'll ask you to refer to the blank Perform risk assessment tool. So starting off with worksheet 1, and that should be highlighted there for you on the screen. And I think I really want to make the point that Perform is so much more than just about filling in a worksheet. Perform is about a whole program. But of course, today's session is really focused on just getting you comfortable with using this risk assessment worksheet. So it is very simple to use, and you can see some of the things that you need to start with worksheet 1. I also want to highlight, when you use this worksheet in the Perform process in your workplace, the really important thing is that it's all about the discussion and the input that the workers are having. Don't get hung up too much on how accurately it's being done. With appropriate training, workers should have a good idea of how to identify and assess the risk factors using this worksheet. But, you know, at the end of the day, the beauty of this is that you are having workers who are talking to supervisors and other people about their problem manual tasks, and they're proactively trying to improve them and come up with solutions. So Perform provides you with the framework to do this. So let's go through worksheet 1. You can see the first part of the Perform risk assessment process It's just about thinking about the task that's been identified by your work team and breaking it down just to think about any of the significant risk factors or things that might contribute. So the risk assessment tool, or this worksheet, is really useful for recording some brief notes about the task. Just think about why would it be a good idea to have a written record of your assessment. So one reason might be if you were to do a before and after assessment, you've got something to go by to see how much the task has improved. Another good reason might be to have a written record to help with re-evaluating controls down the track, and it also provides evidence that the risk assessment has been done. Now, when you're doing the perform training and you're preparing to use the worksheet with your work teams, you and the work team would have ideally identified at least one problem task to start your assessment off with. So you can then go about using the worksheet and doing this assessment in a few different ways. For example, you could video the identified problem task, or a worker in the work team could film their colleagues performing that task. So then you can all assess the task using the worksheet while you're watching the video. It is easier to assess a task using the video rather than trying to assess it live or on site. So because you don't have all the distractions that occur in the workplace, you can replay the footage repeatedly, and you can discuss as a group what's happening, what's going on, what you can see. It can also be very interesting and even eye-opening for workers to see what they're actually doing. Oftentimes they're quite surprised at how repetitive the task actually is, for example. However, video recording may not work for your workplace or your workers for a number of reasons. Workers may not feel comfortable with being filmed. That's okay. Even if a co-worker is doing the filming, that may not work out. So if you're not going to film, then that's fine. You can have the work team discuss the task live or on site. So your workers will need to have good training and somebody who can lead that discussion and help complete the worksheet. Now, it's good to show on the form who you've consulted with, who's been part of that process, and you can see that it has a spot there for you to make that recording. Remember, consultation is one of the requirements under the workplace health and safety legislation. That is consultation with your workers. So you can put in the workers that were involved on worksheet 1. Looking down at the other headings, it's really important to record a description that actually reflects how the task is being done. Don't just go to the the work method statement or any written procedures on the job, but actually view how the job is being done in the workplace. You can also have a look at the Perform Handbook to get an idea of what information you can put in this section. In the back of the handbook in Appendix 2, there are some completed case studies. So the Perform Handbook I referred to last week, that's on our website. So that's got some information to help fill in the worksheet. So looking at why the task has been selected. So it should be picked because you think it is a problem. You're not going to go and assess every task, only the problem ones. So looking at the general description, you really want to put this also in the words that's meaningful to the workers and put some background information. Get some details here. So you might want to look at the tools that the workers are using, or maybe take some measurements. For example, look at how long the task is being performed for. Measure the distance that the workers are travelling. You might want to use a stopwatch to time the cycle time. Look at how long the shifts go for, when workers' breaks are being taken. Think about whether controls have been implemented previously. All that kind of information is really useful to go into Worksheet 1. It gives you a good background to base your assessment on. Now let's have a look at Worksheet 2. This is, I think, the more fun part of the Perform Risk Assessment. So you'll notice this is really where you really assess the risk. just have a look at the top and you can see it's got the instructions at the top, 3 instructions. Underneath that, we'll have the risk factors, and we're going to have a look at those risk factors shortly. On the right-hand side, there is a body map. So let's have a look at the body map. So this is just a bit of a representation of that body map. This is where you would start on the form. So firstly, you start by thinking about which body part, which parts are primarily affected when workers are performing the task. So when you're going through this with your workers, you might ask them, which body parts get tired or sore when they're doing the task? And again, this might differ between workers. People might perform the task a little bit differently. So that's okay. Workers can put in and assess some different body parts. If you're doing it as a group, you do want to try and go with the main consensus. If more than one body part is being affected, we would colour that in different colours, or you could use different shapes. For example, you could use a circle for the lower back, and then maybe you could use a triangle, for example, for the wrist, or you could use a blue colour for the wrist. So it's up to you. The idea is to use the matching colour for the body part when you start scoring the risk factors. Okay, so if you've used a red for the lower back, then when you go to the worksheet, to the matrix there, and you start indicating whether the back came up as a 1 or, sorry, a 3 or a 4 under exertion, then you would mark that with the same colour. So just want to highlight, you can combine different body parts. If you think the task is making different, for example, you might have the wrist and the up arm doing a similar kind of movement, you can combine those body parts. Or you could do the right arm and left arm if they're working together and doing similar movements. So you can combine different body parts and assess them together. And again, it's not about right or wrong. There really is no right or wrong answer. It's just about workers having this discussion around what the problems are in their task, so they can assess as many body parts as they feel are affected by the task. You might want to just assess the right side or left side, so just make sure you do indicate which side of the body is being affected. With assessing the risk factors, you'll see the 5 risk factors are rated on a scale of 1 to 5. So you can see 1 being no risk, and then moving right up to 5 being a high risk. It's so important to keep in mind that you must assess each risk factor separately. Think about the task and focus on the risk factors that are associated with performing this task. We are going to discuss these risk factors in a lot more detail very shortly, and that's really going to help you understand how to rate them. You'll notice also, if you look at the worksheet there where the risk factors are, that there are some words, some questions to help you make the decision about how to rate them. For example, with exertion, it says, well, how much force is the person using? And you can think about starting or stopping quickly there. For awkward posture, it says how awkward is the person's posture. And the words there help you to identify where your posture should fit in. Are most postures neutral, or are they moderately uncomfortable, or are they very uncomfortable? So the wording there is really designed just to give you some support and help you to make that the right rating. It is a part of the assessment that often takes a little bit of discussion with the work team, and again, having the handbook close by to help you make those decisions is really helpful. Now, I'll point out, yes, you're probably seeing that the scale is quite subjective, and we've talked about, it's not about being right or wrong, but generally the results from when we've run our workshops, face-to-face workshops with workers, and going out to workplaces and doing some training workshops there, what we find in those sessions is that when people do their ratings, the ratings tend to be quite consistent. Rarely do we have someone saying, look, I think it's a 2 for exertion, and other people saying it's a 4. We might have some discussion around whether it's a 3 or a 4, so that borderline, you know, but it's generally very consistent, so it's usually not an issue. If your scores come up with a 4 or a 5, that's when you would need to think about controlling that task. A 3 is borderline, so you might even want to consider controls if you do get a 3. Now let's have a look at the manual task risk factors. So how do your manual task injuries actually occur? Basically, the musculoskeletal structure, so we're talking about your muscles, ligaments, tendons, discs, joints, etc. They can become overloaded, and then that can lead to fatigue. Just like any supportive structure, when you have fatigue, that can lead to damage and failure, or in the case of the human body, this would lead to a musculoskeletal injury or a sprain and strain type of injury. So occasionally you can have a one-off exposure to a really severe high load, and that might result in a sprain or strain, but most often your sprain and strain injuries are a result of this repeated ongoing wear and tear. And that's often to the more subtle risk factors that people may not notice, such as repetition and being in awkward postures as well. So to identify the manual tasks that are potentially putting ourselves and our co-workers at risk, we really need to understand the manual task risk factors. So there's so many manual tasks out there and so many different ways that the risk factors present, and we are just looking at the physical risk factors, but it's really important to have an understanding of those. So we are going to spend the next few slides just showing you some pictures of them and really trying to help you understand what those risk factors look like. So the first one we're going to have a look at is force. So this is where you would think about how much force the person is using. Or on the Perform tool, it comes up there as exertion, because it really is a forceful exertion. It's placing high load on the structures in the body, the muscles, the discs, the ligaments, and the joints. So the greater the force, the higher the risk. The force is also relative to the body part. For example, small muscles of the hand, because they're smaller, can only tolerate a little bit of force, a smaller amount of force, compared to the force that larger muscle groups could tolerate. So forceful exertions require muscles to work hard, and then that can cause fatigue, okay, which can start to lead to some microdamage and injuries. When you have fast movements or a real sort of jerking action, that generally requires a high force. So if you think about pull starting a mower, that's going to involve quite a high force. If you have a look at the pictures on the screen there, the top picture shows a lady clipping on a wheel for a wheelchair, and we can see in her hand clearly the tendons bulging. So obviously there's quite a high force in that task. Let's also look at a video, and when I okay, so you should be able to focus on the worker in the yellow vest and see the force that he is using as part of his task. Okay, so I'm sure you would have seen this worker, this poor worker, lifting quite heavy chunks of concrete off the ground. And this, we could clearly see the force that was required to lift these, especially that last piece. So force is one of the risk factors that is probably easier to observe. And often we can see people are struggling, and we know that there's high force there. Think about the tasks that you have at your workplace that might involve forceful exertions or high exertion. often tasks that are designated for 2 workers to do, or a task that people will say, oh yeah, we get the strong guy to do that. So that's a real flag to say that that task probably would come up high in exertion. There's a lot of forceful exertion in those tasks. Let's move on and have a look at the next risk factor. So we're looking at working postures. So the Perform worksheet really focuses on awkward postures. So when you have an awkward posture, that's where your joints are at or near the extreme range of their movement. So, you know, it could be your head bent to your side, trying to touch your shoulder, for example. So ideally we work in a neutral posture. So if you're sitting there at your desk, just look down at your hand. You can put your hand out into a handshake position. So if you have a look at the position there of your hand or your wrist body part, in that handshake position, that's a pretty neutral posture for the wrist. There are tasks that might require workers to adopt awkward postures, and often that is due to the design of the tool or the handle of the tool that they're handling, or the layout of the workplace that they're performing the task in. Now, you might also come across static postures. So that's when you're holding a posture for a prolonged period. Now, Perform does mainly focus on awkward postures. If you have a static posture, it will likely come up as being something under duration. Let's have a look now at some different body parts and postures, just to explore the idea of awkward postures a little bit further, because we often find this is the risk factor that takes people a little bit of thinking about to really get their head around how to rate it. So let's have a look at neck postures. So you can see a series of pictures and some numbers under them. So it's just giving you an idea of how we would recommend for that particular posture, what you might rate it under awkward posture on the risk factor of worksheet. So you can see the comfortable posture there for the neck would be a 1. And then as we have a little bit of flexion, we might be coming towards a 2. When you get towards the end there where you've got quite a bit of rotation or bending, that's when you're looking at getting a 5. Let's have a look at the shoulder postures. So we don't have all the interim ones here. We've just got 1, 4 and a 5. So generally arms down by the side, that would be quite a comfortable one. And anywhere pretty much up to bringing your arm up to shoulder height would be between the 2 to 3. Once you start going above shoulder height there, as we can see the worker in the green shirt, that would probably be a 4. Reaching forward, a 4. And when you're getting to that end range of movement there, that's going to be a 5. Just having a look at the wrist postures. So again, looking at that nice comfortable posture. Now with the wrist is capable of quite a wide range of movements. So, we think of when you're looking at the task and you're looking at the wrist and you think the wrist could be in some awkward postures, have a look at some of the angles there, or how much twisting or deviation you can see in the wrist there. Is it flexing or extending upwards? Is there bending? Look out for those things. As you can see in the pictures, there's some ideas of how you might rate some of the range of wrist movements. Now we're having a look at the back postures, and again, just to give you an idea, standing up straight would be a 1, slightly bending forward a 2, and beyond that would be getting up to a 3. It's interesting to see sitting down is a 4. That's because when we are in a seated posture, it does increase the pressure in the spine. So sitting down would be a 4. Certainly bending forward to access something on the ground, we'd rate that as a 5. So the last body part we're going to look at to explore the awkward postures is the knees. So if you're in a full squat, we'd be looking at a 5 for that posture. So just think about some of the manual tasks at your workplace. What kind of postures do they require workers to use? So hopefully looking at some of these pictures has given you an idea of how you would expect to rate the different awkward postures on the Perform tool. So we're going to move on now to the next risk factor, and this is vibration. So we really are only talking about mechanical vibration here. So mechanical vibration would be where your whole body is subject to vibration. So you might be sitting inside a piece of vibrating plant. So for example, operating a forklift all day. Now whole body vibration generally can cause lower back discomfort or lower back pain. Hand-arm vibration is specifically around using vibrating hand tools. So that can impact on the hand-arm area, and it can cause fatigue, it can cause pain, numbness and tingling, and some longer-term injuries. So look, our guidance around vibration is if it's coming up as a risk factor, it's probably worthwhile just spending your resources on trying to reduce the vibration. Have a look at the seating in your equipment. A lot of equipment today comes with really good seating, but if it's been around for a while, if it's quite getting on in age, you might need to replace the seating. There is some guidance around vibration on the Safe Work Australia website. They have a couple of fact sheets, one on whole body and one on hand-arm vibration. But again, with the Perform worksheet, we're just identifying that the presence of that vibration. It's not going to give you any further assessment on vibration. And again, it's such a complex area, you might just want to spend your resources on trying to reduce vibration if it is an issue for you. Let's have a look at the next risk factor. I think I've skipped to repetition here in my slides. So we'll look at repetition first. So repetition is about repeating the same type of movements over and over again. So we're looking at a particular body part that is repeating the same movements over and over again. And that would become our work cycle. So that's how long it takes to repeat that movement. Generally in the code of practice, it talks about repetition, and it's going to become a problem if you have repetition and the task is less than 30 seconds. It's a problem if you're doing that repetition, the cycle time is less than 30 seconds. It's going to be a problem if you're doing that for an hour or more. So you can see on the Perform worksheet that it has some guidelines there on how to rate the time. So you really need to think about the cycle time and how long it's going for. Is it less than 30 seconds? And that would be a 3 or a 2. Now, if you're getting higher than that, think about whether you'd put it in the 4 or a 5. So a 5 for repetition would be a task that is less than 10 seconds. So we're going to play a video, and I'd just like you to watch this. And think about the body part here is the wrist and hand, and just look at how repetitive this task is and try and think about how long the cycle time might be in this example. Okay, so hopefully that's just given you an idea of that task, and I think you would have said, well, it's just an instant that every movement where that worker picked up the tomato and put it on the other side, that was less than a second. So very repetitive task. So we would rate that as a 5 on repetition. Okay, now let's have a look at duration. So when we're looking at duration, that's the amount of time that the worker is doing the task or essentially being exposed to those risk factors without a substantial break. So typically that would be how long they're doing that task for until they either maybe go for morning tea or smoko, or it might be before they change and do another task. So if it's about when they're going to do a different task, it does need to be a task that does use some different body parts, different types of movements. So one of the limitations with the Perform work tool being such a simple tool is that it won't take into account the cumulative effect of being exposed to risk factors from one task to another. So you do need to remember that the work activities being performed before and after the task that you're being assessed, you might need to take those into account, especially if they do have similar physical demands. Okay, so we've had a look at those 5 risk factors. If you need more information, you can go to the Perform Handbook that has more information on those risk factors in the context of using the Perform worksheet. For even more detailed information, have a look at the Code of Practice for hazardous manual tasks, and both of those documents are on our website. I just want to highlight it is very important to examine the task for each risk factor and assess each risk factor independently. So if you're looking at a task and you think, oh, they're in quite an awkward posture and that would take a bit of force to hold, hang on a minute, you need to think about that task. It's an awkward posture. So you want to assess awkward posture because the force is something different. You would assess that under exertion. So we'll go through how to use the worksheet and do that assessment on some real tasks. We're going to have a look at a practical session now. So I'd ask you to refer to your printed worksheet, and this should be for activity 1 or manual task 1. So the way this is going to work is we'll just have a look through worksheet 1 and quickly look at some of the background information. Then I'm going to play the video of the task that we're assessing. And as we play it, I'd like you to assess the body part. Identify the body parts that you think are primarily being affected by this task. So I'll give you some more instructions once we get up to that stage. Let's have a look at the background on this task. So it's fish preparation, or more specifically, scaling the fish. Now, the workers have identified this as a problem. They're experiencing some strains in the wrists and hands. And if we read on through the task description, we get an idea of that it's highly repetitious. The workers may scale up to 600 fish a day. They're using a handheld scaler. And we've also got a bit of information on how long they're doing it for. And also that they go to other tasks like filleting or shucking, and that the shift the workers do is 8 hours. Probably the more important thing to highlight is that they're doing it for about 2 hours. So we're going to play the video. We'll let it run through a couple of times, and I want you just to focus on identifying which body parts are primarily being affected by the task. So just focus on if you can identify the 2 main body parts. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes, so it'll run through twice, and then we'll get back together and see what you thought. Okay, so hopefully you would have been able to have a look at that video and start with identifying the body parts. And I'm hoping most people would have been able to identify that the wrist or hand, along with the right shoulder, was one of the primary body parts being affected by this task. So we're going to focus on that part of the body. We couldn't see a lot of what was happening with the left-hand side, so we will just focus on the right-hand side. Now what I want you to do is just looking at the wrist. We're going to play the video again for you and think about how you might rate each of those risk factors, starting at exertion and going down, just for the wrist. So we'll play it through a couple more times. If you're sitting with somebody, you can have a chat with them, talk about it, how you might rate that. So we'll only look at wrist. After that, we will come back and go through shoulder. But just go through all the risk factors for wrist and don't go any further. Don't do controls. I'll get the video up now and give you a couple of minutes to do that task. Okay, so hopefully that was enough time for most people to start thinking about the wrist. I'm just going to go through how you might have started assessing that. Now, you should have probably about a 4 looking at the exertion for the wrist. Again, we're not there doing the task, so we do have to make a few assumptions, but it does look like he's using a lot of force to use that tool. And we've also can see in the background information that there is quite a bit of grip involved in holding that tool. If you also think about that work environment, it is going to be quite wet and slippery, and that's going to increase the grip. So that's going to impact on the force required. So looking at the awkwardness of that posture, the wrist was in some moderate kinds of awkward postures, so it certainly wasn't neutral, but it probably wasn't towards the extreme range of movement. There was no vibration in that task. Remember, we're talking about mechanical vibration, so definitely no vibration there. Now, the duration you should have had over 2 hours. It does give you that information in worksheet 1. Now, the repetition, each time he moved his hand and did that scaling action was 1 work cycle. So that's coming up as less than 10 seconds. Okay, so now hopefully everybody has, go back. Hopefully everybody has something similar to that. I'm going to go through the video again, just give you a bit more time, and I want you to rate the right shoulder. So you won't have as long this time. We'll just go through the video once and see how you go with the shoulder. Again, I hope that was enough time for most people to complete that part. Don't worry if it's not, because we will be talking through that now. So for the shoulder, again, we're coming up with quite a high exertion, so a 4. We can see a lot of force being used there for the shoulder. We are coming up with about a 3 for that awkward posture for the shoulder. Look, there is some internal rotation as the elbow lifts up. Some people might want to go a little bit higher, but happy with around a 3 or a 4 for the shoulder there. Certainly no vibration. Now again, for the duration, it's going to be a 5. We've got over 2 hours. And you'll find that when you do your task assessments, that for all the body parts, the duration would generally be the same. And again, the cycle time for the shoulder is also less than 10 seconds. So hopefully this would give you you've got something similar to this on the worksheets you've completed. I'm giving you a profile for this task that looks somewhat like that. And you can see that we have used the red body part for the shoulder and matched that to rating the risk factors, and then the blue for the wrist. So we're going to, when we look at controls, which we're not doing today, but you will focus on the risk factors that are coming up in the 4 or the 5. So yes, this is definitely coming up with some 4s and 5s there. Now we're going to, in the next few minutes, just go through another scenario for you to practice again. So again, I'll play the video for you, and I want you just to identify the primary body parts that are being affected. You might see more, and actually in this task I think you'll see other issues too, but please just focus on the physical risk factors. So this is going to be activity 2, so get that worksheet handy. And there's some background information on worksheet 1. I think in particular I'd like to highlight for you under task description. If you go down to the general description, some important things to note are the number of trolleys that the workers do tend to unload. So this task is about unloading linen trolleys. And then when we go down, we can see some more information on that task. So we can see that there are some above shoulder postures. When we look at postures, the worker says they feel it, so there's a bit of discomfort. The worker's reporting in their arms and upper body when they're unloading it. Looking at the repetition, we've actually got a time there. It says it takes about 45 seconds to unload each trolley. So I'll show the video. I just want you now just to identify 2 main body parts that are being affected by this task, please. Okay, so looking at your worksheet now, worksheet 2, hopefully everybody has identified the shoulders. So we're going to assess the shoulders together. We did see a lot of movement there with the shoulders. And also we're going to assess the lower back. So I hope everybody's comfortable with that, but that's definitely where we would be focusing our assessment. And we'll assess the shoulders and back separately. Now I'll play the video again, and this time I want you to go through the matrix and assess the risk factors for both body parts. So I'll give you a little bit, probably 2 to 3 minutes, a little bit of time, watch the video and see how you go if you can assess the shoulders and then assess the lower back for each of those risk factors. Remember, the information on the worksheet 1 can really help you when it comes to assessing the duration and the repetition of the task. So we might pop that video up now. Okay, so let's have a look at the shoulders to start off with. So we would have gone with the 4 for the exertion for the shoulders, and this would, really be because the worker does seem to be struggling sometimes with some of the linen. You could have wet towels, the linen could be tangled together, so that would require a bit more force to pull those bundles of linen up. And also when they're throwing the linen up into the van, so a fair bit of exertion there. Awkward postures for the shoulders, again, are 4, especially the worker is going quite above shoulder height when he's throwing up the linen. No vibration for this task. Duration, look, we looked at less than 10 minutes because we could see that it took about 45 seconds to unload each trolley. I think it was less than that in this example. And they might only do, at the most 5 trolleys at one hotel. So it's going to be about 5 minutes at the most. Definitely a 1 for duration. And quite repetitive. So we looked at a 5 for repetition. So how did you go with that? Let's have a look at the lower back. Again, a 4 with the force for the lower back. And now we've come up with a 4 for the posture of the lower back too. When you think about how far he was bending forward, now it did vary, but particularly at the end of the task, as he's getting towards the bottom of the tub, it's more of an awkward posture for the back. Again, no vibration, and the duration comes up as a 1. And for the back, it's also going to be quite a repetitive task. So this would have given you a profile like that for your tasks. And we do have some risk factors coming up in the 4 and 5. So definitely a hazardous manual task for that. Now, we're not going to go through the controls today. That's all we wanted to cover for today's session. We've talked about how to identify your problem manual tasks and what the risk factors are, what they might look like, how you can identify those, and also shown you how to complete worksheet 1 and partially complete worksheet 2. If you need more information on those, please go to the handbook, and you can also get more information in the Hazardous Manual Tasks Code of Practice. Next week, we are going to be looking at strategies on how to develop your controls following on from this step. We'll be looking at how important it is to review and evaluate the whole program, and just, I guess, summarising what's needed to implement the Perform program successfully. So if you do want to join us next week, and I recommend you do, so that you do get the final session on the Perform workshop, please make sure that you have registered. If you have any questions, post them there on the Q&A box, and I'll follow those up later for you. Thank you.